To welcome Mr. Colin Smith, a coordinator with the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team at the United Nations for a fireside chat. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Karen Greenberg, Future Security Fellow at New America and non-resident Senior Research Fellow at NYU's Reiss Center on Law and Security, as they discuss monitoring trends and tracking new developments in jihadist terrorism.
Good morning. So nice to see you, Colin. Thanks for coming. Let's get right to it so that we use our time well. In July of this year, the UN's Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, which you are the coordinator of, issued its 36th report on terrorist activities around the globe, 25th anniversary of the report coming out in one form or another. These days, they're semi-annual, and this one was from December of 2024 until through June of 2025. And so before we get to the report itself, I just want you to talk about what sources, how you put it together, what the mandate is for the report and your team.
So it's a very long job title to be coordinator of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, I get that. Essentially, we have two roles covering two regimes. So we cover counterterrorism, AQ, ISIL affiliates. We also cover Afghanistan.
Right.
When it comes to AQ and ISIL, we oversee the implementation of the sanctions regime, and we also do this 6-monthly report, kind of global overview of the threat from different countries' perspectives. And we're quite lucky in the team, or we're quite fortunate in that we're the only expert panel working to the Security Council of independent experts, but who are mandated to engage with intelligence agencies around the world. So basically what we do is we talk to as many people as we can, to as many agencies as we can, and we bring together the various different perspectives, and we try and make sense of it, and we try and reconcile the conflicting views, and the product of that is the report. So for this report, I think we probably had about 35 or 40 bilateral meetings with agencies, in addition to gathering written evidence from about 40 different countries. So it's a pretty comprehensive process we go through, but I think the end result is really interesting, and I think it's pretty unique, actually, in that it's not the view of just one member state. Yeah. It's the view of many member states. It's the view of countries from Africa, of South Asia, of the Middle East, how they see the threat and what their priorities are. So I think from that point of view, it's interesting. And as you say, we've been doing it now for 25 years. Yeah. And I think also that perspective, that trajectory of the threat, how it's evolved over that time, I think makes it a pretty unique product.
Certainly, and as a way of sort of studying the analysis and monitoring of terrorism and the effectiveness of some counterterrorism measures, which we're going to get into. So let's start. I mean, this is the week of 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 anniversary. Let's start with the assessment of Al-Qaeda in the report. And I know the report is divided into areas of the world, but there is a takeaway, a very clear takeaway about Al-Qaeda. Do you want to talk about its strengths, its weaknesses, et cetera?
So very briefly, I mean, I think quite often when we talk about the terrorist threat, people confuse or conflate the threat from Al-Qaeda from the threat from ISIL. Yes. But actually the two are very distinct, and they have distinct ideologies, and in particular very different timelines they're working to. So bin Laden talked about a timeline of 4 to 5 generations. Yes. That's the timeline he was working to, whereas al-Baghdadi, Islamic State, he wanted the quick fix now. Yeah. He wanted to do everything immediately. So I hope in the report we've kind of brought some of that out. But one of the interesting things for me in talking to the various countries we engaged with was this sense of dissatisfaction with Saif al-Adil's leadership, Saif al-Adil being the de facto leader.
So do you know where he is?
I mean, many member states have a very firm view as to where he is, though one member state disagrees with that assessment. So we said in the 35th report, so not the last one, that many member states said he was in Iran, though one member state vehemently objected to that view. So in terms of Saif al-Adil's leadership...
Sorry, I had to ask.
Of course. In terms of his leadership, it's this sense of dissent and dissatisfaction, and the sense that he's almost shouting into the void. So we've heard this before, we've seen this for a while. He has been pumping out propaganda, often about Gaza and Israel, and it's been ignored. In fact, he's even started last year, he even put out press articles in his own name, didn't bother using a nom de guerre, his own name, and he was ignored. But what we're picking up now, very clearly from member states, is this sense of he's a busted flush, that there is dissatisfaction with his leadership, possibly even a leadership challenge. He's not trusted, he's not seen as being the leader for the future. They didn't like his response to Sharar taking over in Syria. AQAP in particular, it seems to be kind of pulling away from AQ senior leadership. Those tensions within AQ are increasingly coming to the surface, and I thought that was very interesting, quite noteworthy. It's a continuation of that trend, but that trend is, it's getting worse and worse for him.
In terms of associated groups with al-Qaeda, what are the strongest one these days that remain, even though there's weak leadership? Any one that's of particular interest?
So the affiliates are increasingly strong. They're increasingly buying into local grievances and co-opting local grievances. They've done that for a while, and that's been the strategy for a while, but it's showing results, increasingly effective. So some of the earlier panelists talked about JNIM.
Yes.
JNIM in Sahel is noteworthy from that point of view, in that it's not just taking territory, it's extending the territory it's holding. Each month it seems to be extending more, and it's becoming a much more powerful and competent military outfit. So we saw a few months back, JNIM carried out attacks on 2 consecutive days, 200 kilometers apart, massing several hundred fighters in both attacks. Now, the ability to do that across an extended distance is actually quite striking. So JNIM is becoming an increasingly effective outfit, and it's also increasing its own capabilities, potentially through the use of foreign fighters. So we've seen this in various parts of Africa, where fighters have traveled from, say, the Middle East, and they've been giving or equipping some of the groups with knowledge, know-how, expertise, especially on drones. So although the drones that JNIM are using are quite rudimentary, essentially they're dropping plastic bottles full of explosive, they're still quite effective. And this increasing capability across the continent through this kind of exchange of knowledge and expertise is driving up the lethality of some of these groups. So I think JNIM stands out, but also al-Shabaab, given its territorial gains in Somalia. And some member states talked about the kind of Kabul's type scenario where a noose could be put around Mogadishu, and al-Shabaab kind of just lobbing in from the outside, not actually having to try and take Mogadishu, but just kind of encircling it and cutting it off. Now, we haven't seen that. We're quite a distance from that, but it's quite notable that member states were talking about this scenario as being a possibility that had to be confronted.
Okay, and so let's turn to ISIL, and which is, as opposed to al-Qaeda's weakness, al-Qaeda's leadership issues, al-Qaeda's, in many ways, arms issues, which we'll get to. Talk to us about ISIL, its reach, its weapons, etc.
So ISIL equally has been kind of shifting emphasis from what might be its traditional homelands towards Africa, because it's a more convenient operating environment for ISIL. That's not to say that it's forgotten about the Middle East. Its heartland is still very much in Syria, Iraq kind of battle space. Dabiq is still critical to ISIL's ideology, but it's difficult to operate in Syria and Iraq at the moment, well, particularly Iraq. The Iraqi counterterrorism forces have made a number of significant, made a lot of progress over the past few months. The death of Abu Khadija, who was the number 2 in ISIL, in an operation in March, was quite a significant setback. So Abu Khadija headed 2 of ISIL's 5 regional organizations. He was deputy so-called Khalif, operational commander, battle-hardened, experienced, and his death is undoubtedly a setback to the organization, but it's a resilient organization. They're aware of these risks, of these setbacks. They've built in a degree of kind of fallback systems and personnel. So this general assessment is Abu Khadija's death is a setback, but it's not going to destabilize the organization. A setback for perhaps the next 6 months, but beyond that, ISIL will probably recover quite quickly. So it's difficult for ISIL to operate there, so they're focusing increasingly on parts of Africa and other parts of the world. ISGS, ISWAP, we talked about them earlier, and they've been increasingly active.
What about the goals of Al-Qaeda versus the goals of ISIL, and in terms of both local populations and in terms of, larger arenas, including the West? How does that play out?
So the tactical goal hasn't changed very much. The strategic goals are similar, but the timelines are very different. Yeah. So they still want to try and establish their Islamic state, their caliphate, where they can impose their pseudo-Salafist ideology. But it's how they achieve those goals. So ISIL is very much, we must do it now, and we will impose this instantly on this particular territory, and you will live like this from now on. Whereas Al-Qaeda has that longer-term game plan. So it is working over 4 to 5 generations, that's what bin Laden talked about. It is trying to co-opt local grievances. Yeah. It has that longer-term, perhaps more subtle strategy, but the strategy is still there. Al-Qaeda hasn't gone away. It's still following that bigger game plan. It still poses the threat. It's just different. It's just not quite as overt or in your face as ISIL is.
One of the things the report talks about is the use of drones and the increase, not just, drones for surveillance, but also drones for, other purposes. And also the use of drone blockers. And just what's going on with drones and the terrorists, and who has them, and where are they coming from, and how are they, how much damage are they causing?
So the use of drones isn't particularly new, in that Aim Shinrikyo, the Tokyo subway attackers, they experimented with the use of drones back in 1995. But what has changed is the barriers of entry have been getting lower and lower, and understanding of how to use them militarily effectively, that's been increasing as well. So I'd be hard pushed at the moment to think about any significant terrorist organization around the world that isn't using drones in some form, whether for propaganda, reconnaissance, or for military strikes and so on. So they are prevalent. And as I said earlier, there's this kind of exchange of information about how to use drones. So we reported that ISWAP, West Africa Province, 13 trainers traveled from the Middle East at the end of last year to train ISWAP on how to use drones. Right. And shortly afterwards, we saw them carrying out their first successful strike using dropping grenades from drones. First-person view drones are the preferred method of attack, and they're being used increasingly and increasingly effectively. We've seen AQAP in particular start from quite a low base to using drones, but also you mentioned drone blockers. They've also been using drone blockers to try and make sure that there's no reconnaissance of their sites, and to try and counter armed forces' efforts to try and locate them, track them, and so on. So we're seeing that kind of drone warfare that we see play out in other theatres. We're seeing it played out also in the terrorist sphere.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a couple times foreign fighters. This has been an issue for a long time. I'm curious about the trajectory of foreign fighters and how it seems to be something that counterterrorism strategies aren't able to deter in a way that we might have thought possible. What's happening in terms of the growth of foreign fighters? Where are they coming from? Where are they going to? And it's persistent throughout the report.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, which I don't have a good answer. So I think one of the interesting things about foreign fighters is FTFs is that although we use the same phrase and have for many years, the nature of what an FTF has changed. So the CT Sentinel did some great research a few years back where it compared foreign fighters that joined AQ in Iraq with foreign fighters that joined Islamic State. And the profile of them was actually quite different, both from where they were recruiting from, the motivation for traveling, the countries they traveled from. I mean, I think there was even a statistic about 80% of the AQI foreign fighters wanted to be suicide attackers, whereas for Islamic State, it was perhaps less than 10%, something like that. Yeah. It's very striking how the profile had changed. Equally, we're seeing the profile of foreign fighters now change, and it's hard to say they're coming from one particular country or forward through one kind of particular motivation. They're coming for a range of reasons, and they're traveling much more than perhaps we've seen previously. So there's not like a single approach or a single trend. It feels much more diffuse now than we've seen previously, but it also feels like there's an uptick in the travel of foreign fighters. So in Syria, there are at least 5,000, probably more, foreign fighters currently in Syria. There are reports of foreign fighters traveling from ISIL Khorasan province towards Syria. ISIL is very keen to attract fighters there. ISIL has also appealed for foreign fighters to travel to parts of Africa. We certainly aren't seeing the kind of movement of fighters that we saw in 2013, but we are seeing something happening here. We are seeing more fighters traveling than we've perhaps seen over the past few years. So it's certainly something we need to keep an eye on, and something we need to try and understand better than perhaps we have previously.
Yeah. You know, you talked about Africa before, but a large part of the report brings up Syria over and over again. And I'm interested in all different parts of Syria and the role it's playing and its ability to manage in this situation, and also about the detention camps and the threat of, you know, what would happen if releases from the detention camps, which we've already seen, right, breakouts. Assess again, with a sense of chronology, the fragility in Syria and just how you assess, you know,
So, I mean, there's a particular
counterterrorism efforts,
Sure. I mean, there's a particular issue in the northeast because of the camps.
Yeah.
ISIL has been keen to try and free fighters from the camps for a while. And if you look back in terms of AQI many years ago, that was also part of their strategy. They had a campaign called Breaking Down the Walls that aimed at prisoner release in Iraq. And it feels like ISIL is trying to do something similar in Syria, whether that's the northeast or the northwest. They've also been looking at prisons in the northwest to see if they can free fighters there. It's been interesting, actually, very soon after the Assad regime fell, we had reports that ISIL was trying to infiltrate into Al-Hol camp in order to provide an access route out, and also to try and reactivate a women-only brigade there, Ansar al-Afifat, to try and ensure that ISIL's ideology was alive and well, and people were being aware of the opportunity or made aware of the opportunity, and to raise funds as well. So we have Al-Hol camp, but also there's a number of other camps in the region in the northeast. So perhaps 10 to 15,000 ISIL former fighters are in prison there. This is a very tempting target for ISIL, so they're keen to see if they can release fighters from there to bolster their ranks.
Which would increase their fighters, is the theory, right?
Yes. But if you look at the kind of CT picture across all of Syria, in addition to ISIL, there's also issues around Khurasan al-Din, which is sometimes called the other al-Qaeda affiliate. In January, Khurasan al-Din announced its own dissolution, but at the same time, although it announced its dissolution, it told its fighters to keep their weapons for the future, just in case. So it doesn't really feel like much of a dissolution. It feels like more of a kind of lowering of the profile. So we have ISIL, there's Khurasan al-Din. There's also this new group, Saraya Ansar al-Sunnah, which carried out the attack on the church in Damascus a few months back. They killed a number of people. I think there were 80 casualties. I can't remember what the fatality rate was, but it was you'll remember the attack. Saraya Ansar al-Sunnah is quite interesting. It says it's not part of ISIL, but at the same time, it's said that anybody who criticizes ISIL is apostate and therefore should be targeted. It's named its media foundation as Dabiq, which used to be the name of the ISIL publication. So this is kind of something we're looking into, but we don't really understand properly the relationship between this group and ISIL and other groups in the region.
Something for your next report?
Quite possibly, yes.
One other thing, I want to get to the recommendations while we still have time. You know, the recommendations, after you read the whole report, are sort of like, you're sort of waiting for some big moment. Okay, this is what we can do, that is what we can do. The recommendations are travel ban related, assets freeze, arms embargo, you know, sort of these things. Can you talk a little bit about the recommendations and then other ones that maybe might come forward in the future that are more geopolitically oriented and
So the report itself has many functions.
Yeah.
And we do it for member states. So member states can use it as a base assessment, so they can understand what happens in one part of the world and how it might affect another part of the world. And it's also used by some organizations to prioritize their funding. So it's used by the OCT to prioritize their funding streams. OSCE, I think, does similarly. In terms of those recommendations, they're really focused on the committee itself, the committee that we work to, the Security Council Committee. So they're kind of technical recommendations for how to make sure the regime is functioning in the best way possible. Because as I said at the beginning, we write the report, but that's half of our job.
Right.
The other half of our job is to make sure that the sanctions regime itself is working properly and is stopping the people that member states tell us are the terrorists and the entities they're working with. It's to make sure that they are subject to the sanctions regime, which is a travel ban, asset freeze, and arms embargo. So we don't want to have a kind of theoretical set of recommendations. We want to be very grounded in what can we actually do to make sure that we are as CT effective as possible. And from that point of view, making sure the travel ban is actually working. That people are not traveling who shouldn't be traveling, that there's no instances of somebody traveling and not being picked up, that it should be identified by any member state, by every member state, in fact. Similarly with the asset freeze, terrorists should not have access to assets. Their entities should not be able to move assets around. So making sure that the asset freeze regime is as effective as possible, that we are contributing to clamping down on terrorist financing, that's an essential part for us. And that's the kind of the practical implementation part for us.
You know, one of the things about ISIL, as opposed to Al-Qaeda, has been sort of newer ways of getting around these, attempts to regulate things, to ban things, et cetera. Do you think that the counterterrorism mechanisms of these states have been up to the task of keeping up with the changes?
That's a difficult question because our role is more analysis rather than kind of policy recommendations. Though I would say that, we've noted it in previous reports, terrorists aren't stupid. I'd love it if they were, but they're not. They listen to what we say, they read what we write. In fact, AQAP put out a press statement last week criticizing our report. So they read what we write and they respond to what we do. So when we clamp down in one area, say terrorist financing, they respond. And sometimes they can be extremely adept at responding to the measures that we take and extremely tech savvy. So when it comes to terrorist financing, we have seen ISIL running online tutorials or running online courses for how to circumvent financing controls or how to use cryptocurrency. So their use of cryptocurrency in some theatres, some individuals, has been very advanced. We need to make sure that member states, all states, are responding to this appropriately. We need to make sure that the committee, the Security Council, is aware of these issues, understands the issues the best they can, and that we're taking appropriate steps to make sure that cryptocurrency is not abused by individual terrorists in order to finance their activities.
Right. I mean, you started by saying, the report is put together by interactions with multiple interviews with intelligence agents, sources, et cetera. But what about other forms of information? Would your recommendation be, do you hope at some point to be able to open this up to other information sources?
Absolutely. So our guiding principle is we want the report to be as useful as possible. We want it to be as used as possible. That means we need to get information from member states, but we need to make sure that we're cross-referencing that with other sources, whether that's open source, academia, scholars, prosecutors, law enforcement. We need to make sure we're bringing that together to provide the most comprehensive and useful picture that we can for member states to use and for other individuals to use. So we're very keen to make sure that we're drawing on those other sources and therefore the product that we're producing is useful.
So that is what you're planning on doing?
Absolutely.
Okay. That's right. One last question about bin Laden. You mentioned that bin Laden was, the long-term versus short-term viewpoint, the difference between al-Qaeda, ISIL, and what's happening today. But what about other things about bin Laden in terms of thinking about localities, thinking about the West, thinking about expansive operations? Is his legacy still there, or do you think it's really moved on to another period?
So I think the ghost of bin Laden is still influencing, is still haunting al-Qaeda and perhaps us as well. It's interesting, AQAP put out a propaganda campaign at the beginning of the year called The Way to Liberate Palestine, and it featured quotes from bin Laden.
Wow.
He was a major feature in this campaign. He is still seen as being the overall guiding light for the al-Qaeda project. And his strategy, his approaches are still the ones that infuse the organization. So I would say bin Laden's ghost is unfortunately alive and well. And I think when I look at counterterrorism today, I sometimes worry that we forget that we look over a shorter term time period. We don't think back about what actually happened 24 years ago. What actually was that original project? What actually was bin Laden saying? How does that affect what al-Qaeda does today?
Colin Smith, counterterrorism coordinator, and coordinator of the UN's Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. Got it right that time. Thank you so much for joining us. That was very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.